In the swirl of dust and the echo of clashing steel upon the banks of the Trident, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Robert Baratheon were fated to decide the outcome of a rebellion that had spread across the Seven Kingdoms. Each bore the weight of the realm's future upon his shoulders. Each man had lost too many friends, spilled too much blood, and carried too many hopes on their blades. Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, sat enthroned in King's Landing and threatened the realm with fire and blood, while Robert, driven by rage and heartbreak at the believed abduction of his beloved Lyanna Stark, led a host determined to end Targaryen rule forever. This was the moment they had all awaited. The thunder of horses and the shouting of men roared in a dreadful symphony around them. War cries, the trumpets of lords signaling the charge, the wet crunch of swords into flesh. On any other day, such chaotic brutality might have numbed each warrior's spirit, but not today. At stake was not just one crown or one life, but the entire shape of Westeros. As the sun climbed high, beating upon the muddied waters of the Trident, the armies aligned in a final clash. The riverside glinted with battered armor, and the standard-bearers of both sides waved the dragon of House Targaryen and the crowned stag of House Baratheon. Leading the Loyalists were men of renowned valor. Barristan Selmy, perhaps the finest knight alive, and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen himself, the silver-haired heir whose own sense of honor and destiny had brought him to this field. On the rebels' side stood the Storm Lord, Robert Baratheon, huge and brawny, famed for his unstoppable warhammer. Joining him were stalwart allies like Eddard Stark, Jon Arryn, and the young, untested knights from the north, the Vale, and the Riverlands, all galvanized by Robert's fiery hatred for the Targaryen regime, or at least for the king it served. Yet, in the heat of the battle, in the thick swirl of dust and blood, Rhaegar's eyes found Robert across the melee. With sweat trickling down his temples, the prince guided his stallion toward the rebel leader. About him lay the chaos of men locked in mortal struggle. Knights of the Kingsguard engaged in furious duels with rebel bannermen, archers letting loose volleys that darkened the sky, and the wounded crying for mercy. Rhaegar could have dived into the heart of it all. He could have raised his sword high and sought Robert's head, perhaps dealing a blow that would end the rebellion in a single stroke. He knew that victory or defeat could hinge upon their personal clash. He also knew that, somewhere behind Robert's frenzied onslaught, Eddard Stark and other northern lords were pressing forward, determined to rescue Lyanna Stark from the Targaryens' hold. He knew that everything, from the ancient line of Targaryens to the precarious peace of the realm, hung by a precarious thread upon the battlefield that day. But in a moment that stunned both his own men and his enemies, the Crown Prince lifted a single mailed fist above his head. The sign he gave, the sign for parley, startled those in close proximity. A lull rippled outward, first among the Targaryen knights who saw their prince's silent command, then among the rebels who noticed the hesitation of their foes. One after another, the savage clamor quieted enough that someone, Barristan Selmy, perhaps, called out for a cease in arms. Men froze, swords raised, uncertain whether the war should pause. And then Robert Baratheon, sweat streaming down his broad face, his dark hair stuck to his brow, frowned at the unexpected sight of Rhaegar's truce signal. For a moment, the Storm Lord's chest heaved in furious confusion. He had dreamed for months of smashing Rhaegar beneath the weight of his warhammer. He had sworn an oath to avenge Lyanna, to punish the Targaryens and topple them from their throne. And here was his hated foe, raising a hand in an offer, or perhaps a demand, of parley. It was a surprising gesture for the rebels, though not entirely unwelcome for some. Robert's men had lost many good soldiers in the earlier skirmishes, and they could sense that a frontal assault on the Loyalist knights would be costly. Eddard Stark, honorable and measured, looked toward Robert and murmured that they should at least hear what the prince had to say. Jon Arryn concurred with Ned. It was improbable that Rhaegar would simply hand over King's Landing, but perhaps the prince, who had been absent for much of the war, rumored to be forging alliances in Dorne and gathering fresh troops, had realized the realm could only bleed so much. Perhaps they could broker some manner of deal, avert further destruction, end the bloodshed that had claimed thousands of souls. Robert, still trembling with the force of his fury, hesitated for a moment before spurring his horse forward. He was no great talker. His warhammer spoke far more persuasively. But he would not appear cowardly before his men. If Rhaegar wanted to treat with him, then let him come forward so Robert could look him in the eye. Maybe stand close enough to kill him if the Targaryen tried to slip in some trick. With cautious glares and readied spears, the warring sides shifted. Soldiers parted to form a rough corridor in which the prince and the would-be usurper might speak. As Rhaegar approached, the silver bells on his armor, bells that once rang in mockery when rumors of his romantic entanglements spread, seemed muted, coated in the grime of battle. His face was as grim as Robert's, though less twisted by hatred. While Robert's eyes fairly gleamed with the memory of every friend he had lost, Rhaegar's carried something akin to regret. He reined in his charger and looked upon the hulking figure of his adversary, taking note of the flecks of blood on Robert's warhammer, the fresh dent in his breastplate, and the crisp dryness in the Storm Lord's eyes that spoke of a man who had passed the threshold of reason. Each second felt like a lifetime. The onlookers, from high-born lords to common men-at-arms, watched breathlessly. "You raise your hand for parley, my prince?" Robert said in a gruff voice that was loud enough to be heard by nearby ranks. "But all I see is the man who took Lyanna Stark and ignited a war. Should I kill you here, Rhaegar, and end this madness? Or do you have something worth saying to me?" Rhaegar's gloved hand tightened on the reins. He drew a breath. "I have come to speak of a truce, a chance for peace, Lord Robert." There was a murmur among the rebel lines. Men shifted uncertainly, not expecting Rhaegar to speak of peace. But the Crown Prince continued, carefully choosing his words in the knowledge that a single misstep could unleash chaos. "I know what my father has done," Rhaegar said. "His cruelty, his madness, has put the kingdom to the torch. He has destroyed families, flouted the vows that bind king to lords, father to son. I know, too, that your cause has not been entirely without merit. The realm has suffered. You have lost people dear to you, and no words can lessen the pain of that. But if we continue this slaughter, tens of thousands more will die. There will be no throne left to dispute. Give me the chance to make it right." Robert stared at him, warhammer in hand. "Make it right?" he repeated as if testing the words on his tongue. "You can't bring back Brandon Stark or Rhaegar Stark, or all the dead in the Riverlands, or the men who died for your father's atrocities." His voice, rough as gravel, trembled with a suppressed rage. "And you cannot restore my betrothed's honor by offering words, Targaryen." The mention of Lyanna made the tension in the air as taut as a drawn bow. Rhaegar's expression twitched, momentarily anguished. "I cannot restore the dead, but I can spare the living," he said. "As for Lyanna, there are truths behind her disappearance that have gone unsaid. But if peace can be brokered, if you would meet with me, away from the butchery of the battlefield, then let us speak of her. Let us speak of the kingdom we both wish to save. If I fail to convince you, you will have your chance to kill me with your hammer, and my men will not stand in your way." It was a precarious promise, and Robert's men recoiled at the very idea that their leader might find himself alone in the presence of the Targaryen prince. Yet Robert found himself oddly compelled. There was something in Rhaegar's voice, something in the sincerity of his bearing, that brought a flicker of doubt to the Storm Lord's mind. And though Robert seethed, though everything in him demanded vengeance, a faint memory surfaced of the songs once sung about Rhaegar Targaryen. That he was a prince who loved his people, that he was once admired even by his enemies for his chivalry and sense of destiny. Could it all have been a lie? Could the death and madness truly be pinned only on Aerys, or was Rhaegar complicit from the start? The hush around them continued. Eddard Stark rode closer, brow furrowed. His eyes flicked between the prince and Robert, measuring the possibility of betrayal. Jon Arryn, with a voice that had the steadiness of experience, murmured that peace was always worth at least a word. And so, though it nearly choked him, Robert dipped his head in a short nod. "Then speak," he said. "Not here with blood and screams in our ears. But I warn you, Rhaegar, this is no cunning move. If you attempt to ambush me, your father's line will end for all time." Rhaegar inclined his head gravely. "I understand," he said. I wish neither for trickery nor for further bloodshed." At the prince's signal, the Targaryen banners drew back, forming a narrow lane on the riverside near a patch of higher ground not thickly strewn with corpses. Robert rode with Eddard, Jon Arryn, and a small guard of men he trusted implicitly, while Rhaegar dismounted, leaving his horse with a Targaryen knight who also gave him a disbelieving stare. Barristan Selmy drew close to Rhaegar's side. The renowned Kingsguard's eyes burned with urgency, perhaps worry that the prince was placing himself in too vulnerable a position. Rhaegar seemed to trust Barristan's presence, for he laid one hand on Selmy's shoulder, as if in silent reassurance. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, the group retreated beyond earshot of the throng. The midday sun cast stark shadows across the battered field as Rhaegar faced Robert. Both men were exhausted, their garments stained by the grime of the long campaign. Rhaegar's silver hair, half-tied and dirted with sweat, hung limp on his shoulders. Robert's jaw tightened with every breath, as though he were holding back a wave of fury. Eddard stood tensely behind Robert, while Barristan Selmy hovered like a silent sentinel at Rhaegar's side. For a moment no one spoke. Then the prince said softly, "My father is beyond reason. He has turned against his own subjects, burning them in wildfires, punishing families with cruelty unimaginable. Even Dorne, once allied so closely to House Targaryen, shudders under his rule. In truth, it was not my intention for the realm to be pitched into rebellion. I knew not how to curb his madness swiftly, nor did I foresee how events would spiral after Lyanna Stark came south." Eddard stiffened. "You speak of my sister as though she were a trinket. She was betrothed to Robert. Your father's men kidnapped her." Robert said nothing, but his grip on the warhammer tightened. The tension in him was like a gathering storm. Rhaegar exhaled slowly. "There is more to Lyanna's departure from Winterfell than my father's men. She was not taken against her will, at least not by me." A hush fell, and Rhaegar continued, careful in his tone. "She and I found each other. I cannot undo what is done, but know that I never intended to dishonor her, nor to place her in harm's way. If I have done so, it is a sin I will bear on my conscience always." Robert let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Lies," he spat. "You expect me to believe that Lyanna would willingly leave me for you? After all we had, after all I swore to her father and brother? You are twisted indeed, Targaryen." Rhaegar's jaw tensed. "I have no illusions that you or Lord Stark will believe me, but if you wish proof, let us resolve this war first. She is alive, Robert. She is in Dorne, at the Tower of Joy in the care of men I trust. If you want to see her with your own eyes, we can journey there. If she refutes my words, you may strike me down at once." Silence blanketed them again, broken only by the distant clang of armor from the uneasy front lines where soldiers watched this improbable meeting. Robert's breathing was heavy. He thought of Lyanna, the girl with the wild, wolfish grin, who had once vaulted over tombs in the crypts of Winterfell with ease, who had teased him for always claiming he would be the greatest warrior in the realm. He had cherished her, or believed he had, though they had spent precious little time together. Could she truly have gone with Rhaegar of her own accord? Eddard glanced at Robert, but said nothing. The swirl of rumors had long plagued them. Even Ned had heard whispers that Lyanna was not quite the docile bride some thought. But the war had overshadowed such uncertain claims. At length, Robert said, his voice low and dangerous, "You said you wish to remove Aerys, that he is mad. Is that the limit of what you offer? I might kill your father myself and take the throne, as the realm would have me do." "You might," Rhaegar allowed. "But you know this war, this rebellion, has already cost thousands of lives, and I fear it will cost thousands more if we press forward. My father is prepared to destroy King's Landing if the city is in danger of falling. He has caches of wildfire scattered throughout. If you force him into a corner, he will burn the city and everyone in it, his own people, innocents. It is madness. I will not stand by and let it happen." Robert's eyes flicked to Eddard. They both knew rumors of wildfire were not idle stories. The Mad King had threatened to burn them all once before, and though Robert's hammer thirsted for Targaryen blood, The death of so many innocents did not sit well with him. Rhaegar spoke again, gently yet urgently. "Let us do this swiftly. I will ride for King's Landing with my best knights. Loyal men who want to see my father deposed before he can commit more atrocities. You, Lord Robert, can bring your own loyal companions if you wish to ensure no trickery. I will confront my father, remove him from the throne, and ensure that justice is done. Then we can speak of the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, the shape of the realm, and the question of my family's future. If you still demand my blood then," he paused, glancing at the warhammer, "I will not run." The proposition was so extraordinary that it almost seemed a jest. Robert could scarcely fathom aligning, however briefly, with the man he had sworn to kill. Yet the image of King's Landing, burning in a green inferno, and the screams of innocent townsfolk gave him pause. Robert glanced at Ned, who observed Rhaegar with cool, calculating eyes. Eddard Stark was not a man swayed by honeyed words, and he tried to gauge the sincerity in the prince's voice. The tension in Ned's face softened minutely. Barristan Selmy, who had thus far held his tongue, finally spoke in a measured tone. "Lord Robert, you know me. You know I have always served honor above all else. If Prince Rhaegar was not sincere, I would not stand here. I have seen with my own eyes how King Aerys has sunk deeper into paranoia and cruelty. The realm needs peace." Jon Arryn, who had joined them, nodded slowly. "The veil has bled enough. We all have. If Prince Rhaegar can truly dethrone the Mad King and avert more tragedy, we must at least see if it can be done." Robert inhaled, battling the anger that roiled in him. But at last, with the specter of wildfire heavy in his mind, he nodded stiffly. "I'll give you this chance," he said to Rhaegar. "But I'll have your vow that you will not flee, that you will not betray us. If you do, the whole realm will know, and I will mount your head on a spike myself." Rhaegar offered a solemn bow. "You have my vow," he said. "We ride for King's Landing before word of our truce can spread. My father must not have time to prepare." So began the most unexpected alliance in recent Westerosi history. Both armies, uncertain and wary, were commanded to halt their hostilities. Many men on both sides struggled to understand how they could stand side by side after so much blood had been shed. The Targaryen loyalists looked on Rhaegar with awe and confusion, uncertain if their prince had fallen prey to some rebel trick. The rebels looked to Robert, astonished that he would place so much trust, or at least so much restraint, in the man they had branded as their mortal foe. Yet the promise of the Mad King's removal held undeniable allure. If Rhaegar was genuine, a swift end to the war might spare them all further devastation. Robert and Rhaegar's carefully chosen retinues made hasty preparations to ride toward King's Landing that same evening, leaving behind enough men to maintain order along the Trident but avoiding a large-scale movement that might alert Aerys too soon. Robert brought with him Eddard Stark, Jon Arryn, and a handful of trusted knights and lords from the Stormlands and the North. Men like Wylis Manderly, who had come south to fight under Ned's banner, and the hulking Great Jon Umber, whose thirst for battle was only matched by his blunt sense of honor. Rhaegar traveled with Barristan Selmy, Ser Jonathan Darry, and a few other knights of the Kingsguard or Sworn Swords who had proven their loyalty to him personally, rather than to the madness of Aerys. They traveled lightly, each group eyeing the other warily during the journey. Many nights they camped in war-weary villages or beside quiet streams, dividing the watch between Targaryen loyalists and rebels who glared at one another across campfires. The mood was tense, but Rhaegar made efforts to speak with Robert's companions politely. Occasionally, he conversed at length with Eddard Stark, inquiring about the well-being of House Stark's remnants, and apologizing in a subdued manner for the king's horrifying execution of Brandon and Rhaegar Stark. Ned's replies were curt but polite. He did not wish to provoke a rift, yet his sorrow for his father and brother remained too raw for camaraderie. Meanwhile, Robert spent much of the journey brooding, torn between suspicion and a reluctant glimmer of hope. The possibility that Lyanna might still be alive and safe haunted him. He yearned to see her, though the part of him that raged for her abduction felt betrayed by the mere notion that she had gone willingly. He found it difficult to imagine Lyanna's bright, fierce spirit yearning for the Targaryen prince, but stories were swirling in his head. Old songs that told of tragic romances, rumors he had dismissed as Targaryen propaganda. He drank more than usual, wrestling with his emotions. After many days of cautious travel, they crossed into the Crownlands. The farmland around King's Landing showed signs of war. Burned fields, abandoned homesteads. The people who lingered eyed the arriving party with dread. Rumors about the Mad King's volatile behavior spread quickly. Whenever Rhaegar approached, they cowered or turned away, uncertain whether this Targaryen was any different from his father. Robert, for his part, felt no compassion for the Targaryens as a whole, but he pitied these frightened small folk who had borne the brunt of the war. At last, they spied the walls of King's Landing, great and gray and forbidding. The rumor of an oncoming combined force must have preceded them, for the gates were barred, and the gold cloaks upon the battlements peered down uncertainly. Rhaegar rode forward, calling for an audience with the king. At first, there was no response, but soon, a scattering of scrawny gold cloaks opened the gates just enough to let the prince's party inside. Robert's retinue, some of them bristling with weaponry, was met by suspicious stares. As they entered the city, the gloom of a fearful populace was everywhere. The streets were largely empty, the windows shuttered. At certain corners, the faint stench of old, dried blood lingered where the king's men had punished suspected traitors or enemies of the crown. Rhaegar frowned at the sight, while Robert looked about in anger, seeing how the city he had once visited in his youth had become a place of fear. Under the watchful eyes of the gold cloaks, the party moved toward the Red Keep. The fortress loomed atop Aegon's high hill, a massive structure of red stone. Banners of House Targaryen hung from its ramparts, though some were tattered. As they entered the courtyard, dozens of Lannister men were conspicuously absent. Perhaps they had not yet chosen a side, or perhaps they had retreated to Casterly Rock after the outbreak of war. The men in the courtyard were primarily loyalists to the king, or gaunt and nervous courtiers who stared at Robert Baratheon as though he were an invading dragon. Word spread quickly. Prince Rhaegar has returned. He has brought rebels in his train. Near the base of the keep steps, they were confronted by Lord Varys, the master of whisperers, who bowed low, his powdered face composed, though his eyes flicked between the men. Grand Maester Pycelle stood nearby, wringing his hands. Ser Jaime Lannister, clad in the resplendent white of the Kingsguard, lingered close to the entry doors, an uneasy look flickering across his handsome features. Rhaegar dismounted and stood in front of the huge keep, shoulders square. Robert and his allies dismounted as well, each man's hand close to a sword or hammer. "The king is in the throne room," Varys purred, offering Rhaegar a measured nod. "He has been expecting you, my prince, though not with such august company." Rhaegar ignored the jibe and motioned for Barristan to accompany him. Robert and Ned followed, equally determined. They ascended the steps into the Red Keep's entrance halls, footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Tension simmered. At every turn, clusters of gold cloaks and servants parted to let them pass. The air smelled of incense overlaid with an undercurrent of something acrid, something that set Robert's teeth on edge, a faint whiff of sulfur that made him think of wildfire. The throne room doors opened, revealing the grand hall with its iron monstrosity at the far side. The Iron Throne, forged from the swords of Aegon's vanquished enemies, jutted out in sharp, twisted angles, and upon it sat Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King. His hair and beard had grown long and unkempt, tangling around his gaunt face. His eyes burned with a feverish light. He wore robes of black and red, though the hem was stained with what looked like old blood. Jaime Lannister quietly followed them inside, moving to stand at the base of the throne steps, poised like a cat ready to spring. The king's cracked lips parted in a wide sneer at the sight of his son walking in with Robert Baratheon. Huddled near the edges of the room were a handful of courtiers, some of them trembling, others expressionless. Pyromancers, recognizable by their stained robes, lurked in the corners as well. Rhaegar could almost feel the wildfire's presence in the air, as if the Mad King had it perpetually at the ready. So the traitor returns with a traitor at his side. Aerys hissed, his voice echoing in the hall. Do you come to kneel, Rhaegar? Or do you come to burn like all the others? Rhaegar stepped forward, back straight, chin lifted. Father, he said respectfully but firmly, the war has ravaged the realm. We must end it. There is still time to preserve Targaryen rule in a manner that spares countless lives. But we must put an end to this bloodshed. Aerys cackled, a high, brittle sound. Bloodshed is what keeps them in line, my son. Haven't you seen? They would tear us apart if we gave them an inch. You think you can trust that rebel scum by your side? He means to take our throne, to murder us all, just like the usurper he is. Robert bristled at that, but he held his tongue, remembering Rhaegar's instructions to let him speak first. Ned stood behind Robert, scanning the hall for any sign of an ambush. Father, the rebels marched because you gave them reason, Rhaegar said. You slew Ricard and Brandon Stark unjustly. You threatened to burn the city. You have alienated our allies in Dorne, and House Tyrell wavers. You have forced men like Robert Baratheon to rise in arms. He is not here to kill you if you will step down. He is here to ensure the realm's safety. If you do not yield, if you insist on burning the city, no one will remain loyal. Yield. Aerys' voice cracked. He rose halfway out of the throne, veins bulging in his scrawny neck. I am king, anointed by the Seven, the living embodiment of the dragon's might. I will never yield. I will show them all. I will turn this city into a furnace if I must. Pyromancers. At the king's shout, one of the robed pyromancers stepped forward, a furtive gleam in his eye. The tension in the throne room spiked. Robert's grip on his warhammer tightened dangerously. Even Jaime Lannister looked uncertain, glancing at Rhaegar, as if weighing if this was indeed the moment to intervene. Father, Rhaegar said louder this time, this is the last chance. If you do not stand down, your people will die. Are you so mad that you would burn your own city and call it victory? If you do this, you will not be remembered as a king, but as a monster. Better a monstrous king than no king at all, Aerys snarled, spittle flying. Now you presume to conspire with my enemies in my very throne room. Are you a traitor, Rhaegar? Are you? A hush fell. The courtiers shrank back. Barristan Selmy's jaw clenched. Robert edged closer to Rhaegar, ready to intervene if needed. Aerys' eyes flicked from his son to Robert's formidable presence, and for a moment, he seemed to sense how precarious his position was. But if that knowledge frightened him, he did not show it. Instead, he lifted his hand in a trembling gesture for the pyromancer to step closer. Rhaegar's heart thudded. He realized that the king might actually give the order to burn them all, right here, right now. In a desperate effort, he called out, Ser Jaime, will you let him ignite wildfire in this hall, with the city's populace just outside? Jaime's eyes narrowed. I have sworn to protect the king, he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. A flicker of doubt lingered in his gaze. Aerys shrieked, You will do as I say, boy, or I will have your head, Kingsguard or not. The king's hysterical rant echoed, and in that moment, the pyromancer raised a small flask with trembling hands, as if to fling it down and ignite the hidden caches. Everything happened at once. Barristan Selmy rushed forward, sword flashing. Robert roared and surged ahead, brandishing his hammer. The pyromancer fumbled, fear strangling any dexterity he possessed. Jaime Lannister drew his sword, and for an instant, it was unclear whether he meant to strike at Robert, Rhaegar, or the king himself. But Rhaegar moved with a swiftness that surprised them all. He lunged, seizing the pyromancer's arm to prevent the flask from shattering. The man yelped. Barristan's blade raked across the pyromancer's chest, sending him collapsing with a groan. The flask dropped but did not break, rolling along the floor, trailing greenish fluid. Aerys shrank back against the iron throne. No, traitors, he shrieked. His eyes flicked around desperately. All of you traitors, burn them all, burn them all. Jaime Lannister stood at the foot of the throne, sword in hand. His face was pale, contorted by an internal war between loyalty to his vows and the horror of what the king intended. In the hush that followed the pyromancer's fall, only Aerys's ragged breathing could be heard. Robert lifted his warhammer, and for a heartbeat, it seemed he would simply crush Aerys where he sat. But Rhaegar raised a gloved hand, halting Robert. Panting, the prince turned to his father. In the man's face, he saw no shred of sanity, only terror and cruelty. Rhaegar felt a wave of sadness so deep it threatened to undo him. "Father," he said thickly, "I cannot let you do this. Surrender. Please. Surrender." Aerys's voice cracked. "Never. Never. I am the king." No further words could be spoken. In a blink, Jaime Lannister moved. Something in the young knight's face snapped. The vow he made to protect the king warred with his vow to protect the innocent, and the latter triumphed. With a fluid thrust, Jaime's sword pierced the king's side. Aerys gasped, eyes bulging, and staggered forward off the throne. His blood spattered the iron blades as he crumpled to his knees. A silent shock rippled across the hall. Time seemed to slow. Robert stared in disbelief, warhammer half-raised. Rhaegar stood stunned. The courtiers let out terrified squeaks, while Grand Maester Pycelle tottered backward. The Mad King fell, and a rivulet of blood ran across the floor, mingling with the spilled wildfire. Jaime Lannister, stunned by his own deed, yanked his sword free. Aerys's eyes, wide with shock and hatred, flicked to Rhaegar. His last breath was a choked whisper, "Traitor, burn all traitors." Then life left him, and he collapsed, lifeless, at the base of the Iron Throne. For a moment, no one moved. The king was dead. The Mad King was gone, just like that, by the hand of his own Kingsguard. Rhaegar closed his eyes, taking in a ragged breath. The realm-shaking consequences of that single thrust seemed to hang in the air. Then Robert exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing a fraction. He looked at the corpse, then at Rhaegar. "It's done," Robert said, voice low with something that might have been relief or shock. "He's gone." The courtiers, the gold cloaks, the onlooking knights, all seemed stunned to their core. Some might have expected Robert to let out a triumphant cry. Others might have thought Rhaegar would weep for his father. Instead, a deep silence reigned. Jaime Lannister stared at the blood on his sword, his handsome features twisted in revulsion and something akin to betrayal. Then he threw the blade aside with an echoing clang, as if it had burned him, and turned away from the corpse. Rhaegar blinked, forcing himself to step forward. He crouched beside his father's body, ignoring the reek of blood and wildfire. "You gave me no choice," he murmured, though Aerys could not hear. Then he rose, turning to face Robert, who still held his hammer. "We must ensure the city is safe. The pyromancers, there may be caches of wildfire hidden. We must root them out before they cause further destruction." Robert regarded the prince for a long moment. He gave a short nod. He said, "I'll help see it done. But after that, we talk. About the throne. About your sister." Rhaegar met his eyes firmly. "So we shall," he said. "Let us secure the realm first." A group of men fanned out to search the Red Keep for more pyromancers and hidden caches. Rhaegar commanded the gold cloaks to stand down, reminding them that the king was dead and that as crown prince, he was now in command until the succession was determined. Many looked frightened, uncertain which side to choose, but seeing Robert Baratheon at Rhaegar's side gave them pause. Word spread quickly through the keep. "The Mad King is dead. Prince Rhaegar lives. Robert Baratheon has come to treat, not to sack the city." For the moment, panic lessened. The dreadful, mindless order to burn everything was not carried out. In the following days, a tense calm settled over King's Landing. Rhaegar and Robert, along with Eddard Stark, Jon Arryn, Barristan Selmy, and other key figures, took command of the city's defenses. They discovered that indeed, Aerys had hidden caches of wildfire beneath the Great September of Baelor, below the Dragon Pit, and in other strategic locations across King's Landing. Rhaegar worked with the pyromancers who had not been loyal to Aerys's destructive impulses. ensuring the dangerous substance was neutralized. Robert took charge of a contingent of rebels who entered the city to restore order in the streets, punishing any who took advantage of the chaos to loot or riot. Rumors spread among the small folk that Robert and Rhaegar had called a truce. Some cheered, relieved that the violence might be ending. Others glowered, certain that the Targaryens would never truly atone for their crimes. In the Red Keep itself, courtiers walked on eggshells, unsure whether a new Targaryen reign would begin or if Robert Baratheon would claim the crown he had fought for. Tension simmered. Each night, Rhaegar retired to his old chambers in the keep, which had lain unused for months while the prince had been away at war. The knowledge of his father's end weighed heavily on him, yet he also felt an odd sense of relief that the threat of wildfire had been averted. He penned letters to Dorne, to Prince Doran Martell, explaining the events and seeking to reassure them that no retribution would befall Elia Martell or her children, Rhaegar's wife and offspring, who remained in the Red Keep. Meanwhile, Robert slept in guest quarters with his men close at hand, wary of a knife in the dark. He drank heavily each evening, but he also conferred frequently with Eddard, Jon Arryn, and other lords, discussing what to do next. Finally, when the city was secured, the two factions gathered in the throne room again, though this time, the Iron Throne stood empty. The body of King Aerys had been removed, prepared for a quiet funeral. It was a pale, cloudy day outside, as though the gods themselves were uncertain how to greet this new turning. Rhaegar stood at the foot of the throne dais, dressed not in a crown but in the simple finery of a prince. Robert stood with Eddard, Jon Arryn, and his other lords a bit farther back. The hush in the cavernous hall was broken only by the murmurs of men and women who had come to witness the unfolding of history. Members of the small council like Varys, Pycelle, and Queen Rhaella's ladies-in-waiting, as well as knights and officials who had survived the final days of Aerys' rule. Jaime Lannister was absent, though many guessed he was closeted somewhere, grappling with his crime of regicide and whatever consequences it might bring. Rhaegar began to speak, his voice echoing across the hall. "We stand on the brink of a new day, for my father's reign has ended. The question now is, what shape shall the realm take? I was born to be the crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms, but I have seen that our house has committed grave crimes against its people, crimes that weigh heavily on me. My father's madness drove many to rebellion, and that rebellion did not arise without cause." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Therefore, I propose that we end this war permanently by forging a peace that acknowledges the wrongs done and ensures accountability. I will renounce any claim to absolute, unchecked monarchy. The power of the crown must be balanced by respect for the great lords, by the rights of the people, and by justice that does not bend to the whims of madness." Some whispered among themselves, surprised. Robert stared at Rhaegar, arms folded. After a moment, the Storm Lord stepped forward. "That all sounds well enough," he said. "But who sits the throne, Targaryen? You or your children? Or do you think I'd place that damnable seat in your hands after all that's happened?" Rhaegar met his gaze steadily. "I believe the Seven Kingdoms would benefit from a fresh start, a new ruler untainted by the sins of my father. Some have said that you, Robert Baratheon, would take the throne, claiming descent from House Targaryen through your grandmother, Rhael. Others might point to my own inheritance. Yet we have an alternative. I will take the throne, but with checks on my power enshrined by a great council, and with the support of each great house. Or if the realm wills it, and if you yourself are willing, I could step aside in favor of a regent council that includes you among others, until my son is of age. The details must be decided by the lords of the realm, not by force of arms." Robert's expression flickered. He had not imagined that Rhaegar might willingly place so much authority in the hands of the lords. The Storm Lord had, for so long, dreamed of taking the throne outright, smashing the Targaryens underfoot. Now, as the war stilled, a more complex reality presented itself. He considered the thousands of men who had died on the Trident and beyond, the chaos that had shaken the realm, and the knowledge that if it resumed, more blood would flow. But something else burned in Robert's mind. Lyanna Stark. He stepped closer, his voice dropping but still echoing in the high hall. Before we settle this, Targaryen, I have one demand. Lyanna, is she alive, as you said? Will you take me to her and let me see the truth of your words? A shadow passed across Rhaegar's face. She is alive, he said, and I will take you to her. If she chooses to return with you, you have my word that no harm shall come to her. If she chooses... He stopped, glancing at the hush that fell across the assembled. We shall see, he concluded quietly. Eddard Stark's jaw tensed. He had not spoken of Lyanna much since entering the city, trusting Robert to speak for them both. But Ned's eyes slid to Rhaegar, searching for the slightest hint of falsehood. He saw none that he recognized. When? Ned asked quietly. How soon can we go to her? As soon as the lords here can appoint an interim council to keep order in the city, Rhaegar replied. My sister, Daenerys, is but a child and remains with my mother on Dragonstone. My wife, Elia of Dorne, is here with our children. House Martell must be reassured of their safety. Once we have put in place the means to preserve peace in King's Landing, I will travel with you, Robert, and whomever else you choose, to the Tower of Joy. The words sent a murmur through the onlookers. Most had heard rumors of a secret tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne where Rhaegar had hidden something, but few believed it was Robert's betrothed. Now it seemed the rumors were true. The notion that the prince and Lyanna Stark had been together willingly was so strange to the assembled lords that many found it impossible to credit. Yet the tension in the room had shifted from near-violent confrontation to a tenuous possibility of reconciliation. Robert drew a slow breath, nodding. Then we shall see. But understand me, Targaryen. If you have lied about her well-being, if you have done her harm, no power on earth will keep you safe from my wrath. Rhaegar acknowledged that with a somber bow of his head. Understood. The following weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations. Rhaegar convened the great lords still in King's Landing, along with representatives of houses that had declared for Robert. Ravens flew across the realm, bearing news of the Mad King's death and the precarious truce between the Targaryens and the rebels. Some lords rejoiced, particularly those who had wavered in their loyalty, fearing the king's vengeance. Others raged, feeling they had been robbed of vengeance upon the Targaryens. But momentum was on the side of peace. Few desired to continue a war that had only grown bloodier as time wore on. In King's Landing, Rhaegar and Robert reached an uneasy rapport, if not genuine friendship, then at least a shared recognition that the realm desperately needed stability. Jon Arryn proved instrumental in mediating, as did Eddard Stark, whose sense of honor demanded that he seek a just outcome, even if it meant dealing with the Targaryens he despised. The Watchers from across Westeros marveled at this new dynamic. Barristan Selmy remained at Rhaegar's side, quietly proud of the prince's attempts to redeem House Targaryen, while other Kingsguard members wrestled with the guilt and confusion left by Aerys' downfall. Ser Jaime Lannister was stripped of his white cloak for having committed regicide, despite the rationale that it was the only way to stop the king's madness. He accepted the condemnation with a sardonic sneer, though Rhaegar later met with him in private, thanking him for his actions that saved the city. Jaime responded with bitterness, saying he would sooner be remembered as a kingslayer than see the realm burn, but that the name Oathbreaker would haunt him forever. At last, enough stability prevailed that Rhaegar felt confident in leaving the city. A small council formed, with men like Jon Arryn, Hoster Tully, and others who had come to see peace as the best way forward. Robert insisted he would bring Ned and a handful of his most loyal knights, while Rhaegar would bring Barristan Selmy, a few Martell knights, and no others. It was a delicate compromise. They would head south to the Tower of Joy. The journey took them through the storm-tossed passes of the Dornish Marches, land that had seen its share of skirmishes, but which now lay quiet in the wake of the new royal directives. Word had reached Doran Martell in Sunspear, and though House Martell remained wary, they were no longer outwardly hostile, seeing that Rhaegar had brought the war to a close and guaranteed the safety of Elia and her children. The trip took several days. Robert was tense throughout, convinced that the Targaryens would spring a trap. Ned was equally wary, though he hid it behind his unruffled northern composure. Rhaegar spoke little during the ride, occasionally conferring quietly with Barristan, sometimes exchanging stiff words with Robert about how they might address the lords of the realm once Lyanna's fate was confirmed. They traversed the red mountains of Dorne, passing by scattered villages whose inhabitants watched them with wide, cautious eyes. Some recognized the Targaryen prince and bowed timidly, while others cursed the presence of Robert Baratheon, the man who had led armies that had once threatened Dorne. But there were no open hostilities, for both sides recognized that this was the closest Westeros had come to peace in many moons. Eventually, they reached the lonely gray tower perched high on a ridge overlooking the desert plains. The Tower of Joy, named ironically for the hush of sorrow that clung about it. 3 Kingsguard knights awaited them there: Ser Oswell Went, Ser Gerald Hightower, and Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. Robert's men were immediately on guard, for these knights were famed warriors, sworn to protect the prince's secret. Robert eyed them warily, hands twitching near the handle of his warhammer, but Rhaegar raised a hand in a sign of peace. "We have come to see Lyanna Stark," Rhaegar said, his voice echoing softly against the stony cliffs. "I gave my word to Lord Robert Baratheon and Lord Eddard Stark that they would see her in safety. Stand aside." Arthur Dayne's silver-white hair gleamed in the sun. He looked from Rhaegar to Robert with a guarded expression, then lowered the great sword Dawn, which he carried sheathed across his back. "If you will it, my prince." The trio of Kingsguard parted, allowing Rhaegar, Robert, Ned, Barristan, and a few others to pass. Beyond the tower's narrow steps, they found a simple door of oak. Rhaegar led the way inside, his breath quickening. The tower's interior was dimly lit by arrow-slit windows. They ascended a spiraling staircase until they reached a small chamber near the top. There, lying upon a bed, was Lyanna Stark. Her once lively face was pallid, her frame thinner than Ned remembered, but her gray eyes still burned fiercely with that same wolfish spirit. She sat up with effort as they entered. A servant girl hovered nearby, startled by the arrival. As Robert stepped forward, eyes wide as if he could barely believe she was real, Lyanna focused on him with a wary half-smile. "Robert," she said softly. Then her gaze slid to Ned. "Ned, you came." Ned rushed to her side. Eyes brimming with tears he refused to shed in front of so many men. He took her hand gently. "Lyanna," he breathed. "Are you hurt? What have they done to you?" She shook her head. "I'm not hurt," she said. Then, with a steel that surprised him, she added, "No one forced me to come here. I rode with Rhaegar because—" She paused, glancing toward the prince. "Because I believed in what he was trying to do. I never wished for war." Robert stared, expression torn between relief and betrayal. "You," he began, voice trembling. "You disappeared, Lyanna. You left me, left your family. I thought you were taken. Gods. I started a war to get you back." Lyanna's eyes dropped, and sorrow twisted her features. "I never wanted a war. If you truly believed I was kidnapped, Robert, I'm sorry. I never meant to cause so much devastation. Rhaegar told me he sought to end his father's cruelty, to avert the madness that was consuming the kingdom. I believed there might be a chance for change. I see now how naive I was." Her eyes flicked to Ned, then back to Robert. "What can I say that will make this right?" Robert swallowed hard, fists clenched. For a moment, he seemed on the brink of unleashing all his fury. Then he saw how pale Lyanna was, how haunted her eyes were. He let out a shuddering breath. "All that matters is that you're alive," he said softly, though an undercurrent of pain remained in his voice. "I thought I'd lost you forever." She nodded, blinking back tears. "You almost did." Ned looked at the prince, who stood quietly by the chamber door. "How long has she been here?" he asked. Rhaegar's voice was calm. "Since shortly before the rebellion began. I sheltered her here for her protection, and for the child." The words landed like thunder. Ned's gaze darted sharply to Lyanna's midsection. She was covered by blankets, but the suggestion made his heart pound. "Child?" he repeated, voice tense. Lyanna swallowed, nodding. She flicked a glance at Rhaegar, who inclined his head solemnly. "I bear Rhaegar's child," she said, her voice trembling. It was not something I intended to be hidden, but I feared what father would do if he discovered, and what Robert might do. The wave of silence that followed was deafening. Robert's eyes turned wild, his breath coming in ragged bursts. You, his child? He said, voice scraping low. That cannot be. You were promised to me. Lyanna closed her eyes briefly, guilt washing across her face. I was. But Robert, my heart turned elsewhere. Tears glimmered on her lashes. I've wronged you in 1,000 ways. I don't expect your forgiveness, but let no one ever say I was forced. This was my choice. Robert stood like a statue, each muscle taut. The swirl of emotions within him was almost palpable. Heartbreak, betrayal, lingering love, and an unrelenting sense of being robbed. Ned, too, struggled with anger and confusion. But in the hush that gripped the room, the reality became inescapable. Lyanna had lain with Rhaegar, willingly, and now carried a child of Targaryen blood. Rhaegar spoke quietly, stepping forward. Lord Robert, Lord Stark, I know how grievous a blow this is to your family's honor and to your heart, Robert. But let us not dwell on the tragedies that brought us here. Instead, let us look forward. The realm is in need of peace, of healing. And that child, he glanced at Lyanna, shall be a symbol of that possibility. A child of ice and fire, Stark and Targaryen, who might unify the realm if we can put aside our hatred. Robert stared at him, chest heaving. The Storm Lord had never imagined that such a nightmare could become real. He had accepted the possibility of Lyanna returning to him, battered or traumatized, a victim in need of rescue, and then they could remain betrothed, wed, and eventually heal. But this, it was almost too much to bear. Lyanna looked at Robert, voice trembling. I'm sorry, she repeated. I never intended to break your heart, but I cannot change what has happened. If you wish to punish me, or Rhaegar, or both of us. No, Robert ground out, pressing a hand to his forehead. No, I don't know. He paused, trying to steady himself. The realm needs peace, you say. If I kill you now, he said, glaring at Rhaegar, we plunge back into war. Thousands more will die. Lyanna is with your child. His expression was stricken, as though the fates themselves mocked him. The realm cannot endure more suffering, not with the Targaryens still in King's Landing, not with half the great lords uncertain which side to choose. Ned set a hand on Robert's shoulder. We'll find another way, Robert, he said softly. We'll see that justice is done without more bloodshed. Let's get Lyanna home. See her well. Lyanna's eyes flashed. I will go with you, Ned, she said. But I must also consider the child. That child is half Stark. I will not see him or her cast aside. Rhaegar nodded, though his face was drawn. And I will not abandon either of them. If we are to forge a lasting peace, then we should speak of alliances, of recognition of the child's claims. Lord Robert, this is your chance to shape a new future for Westeros, even if it is not the one you imagined. Robert clenched his jaw, turning away as though he might lash out. But slowly, his posture drooped, resignation creeping in. Damn you, Rhaegar, he muttered. And damn me for not seeing this coming. Fine. Let's return to King's Landing and see how we can manage this travesty. The war is done, and I've no taste for more blood. Ned exhaled, relief warring with heartbreak. Lyanna's life was spared, and so was the child's. But they all knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Robert's pride had been dealt a crushing blow. House Stark had lost Ricard and Brandon, and now faced a scandal that would shake the lords of the North. House Targaryen stood on precarious ground, for the realm did not wholly trust them. Yet, perhaps ironically, it was that precarious balance, Rhaegar's remorse and Robert's exhaustion with war, that opened a path forward. They departed the Tower of Joy with Lyanna in tow, riding carefully so as not to risk her health. The Kingsguard knights there, satisfied that the prince's will was carried out, followed behind at a respectful distance. Robert was silent for most of the journey back, while Lyanna and Ned spoke in low tones of what would come next. Would she remain in King's Landing? Return to Winterfell? Rhaegar tried to give them space to decide. He made one thing clear. If she returned to the north, she would still have his protection, and if the child was born, it would be recognized as a trueborn Targaryen through a secret annulment of his marriage to Elia Martell, something Rhaegar had considered but never finalized. The revelation caused Ned and Robert fresh waves of anger, for it suggested Rhaegar had set aside Elia for Lyanna. But the truth was more complicated, for Elia had been gravely ill after the birth of Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon, and Rhaegar had sought to fulfill a prophecy he believed in. The swirling motivations and half-truths only added layers to the complicated tapestry of alliances. In King's Landing, the next few months were a tumult of negotiations, culminating in an arrangement that few lords of Westeros had predicted. Rhaegar Targaryen was crowned king, but only after signing into law a series of measures that limited the absolute power of the monarchy, granting a formalized council of lords a significant voice. Robert Baratheon was named Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, recognized as a hero of the realm, and given a seat on the royal council, though his personal heartbreak over Lyanna remained unresolved. Eddard Stark returned north with his sister, and for a time, it seemed she and the unborn child would reside in Winterfell for the sake of her health. Whether she would ultimately become Rhaegar's wife in a formal sense was left ambiguous, pending the arrangement with Elia Martell and the Stance of Dorne. Elia Martell, for her part, was treated with honor and retained her title as princess consort, though rumors swirled that the union was effectively ended. Prince Doran Martell, seeing that war would only bring further harm, accepted the arrangement, though with undisguised regret. Barristan Selmy was named Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, while Jaime Lannister, stripped of his white cloak, left the city in shame, heading back to Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister, scorned by Aerys for years, had never marched his forces definitively for either side, waiting to see which way the tide turned. When the war abruptly ended, the new King's Council viewed the Lannisters with suspicion. Tense negotiations ensued, but no open conflict materialized, for Tywin recognized that attacking now would only bring condemnation from all sides.